Alright guys, this set of video notes is going to go over some basic principles of genetics, and it's going to cover a lot of vocabulary, so make sure you're keeping up. Genetics is defined as the study of heredity. Some of you may be wondering what heredity is, and that's just the passing of a trait from the parent to the offspring. So it's the passing of brown hair from your parent to you, or the passing of blue eyes or freckles. So whatever trait it is, whatever's being passed from parent to offspring, that's the process of heredity. And traits are just different forms of characteristics. So you have different traits for eye color, you have hair color, widow's peak or no widow's peak. All of those are traits that you can get. The main person that we talk about when we talk about genetics is going to be Gregor Mendel. He is the main scientist who figured out the whole concept of genetics. And how he did this was he had pea plants that he was growing, and they were all different. Some were tall, some were short. Some came from a green seed, some formed a yellow seed. They had all these different characteristics, and he wondered why. Why were they all so different? So what he did was he cross-pollinated the pea plants. So that means he took pollen from one plant and brought it to another to fertilize it. And he did this to see how specific traits were going to get passed on. And because of all of this discovery he was figuring out with traits and characteristics of pea plants, we consider him the father of genetics. He figured out specifically that the traits that we get are carried in pairs. Okay, so we know we get 23 from mom, 23 from dad to make the grand total of 46 chromosomes. So Mendel's the guy that figured out that these traits we have come in pairs and they come on chromosomes. Okay, chromosomes are made up of DNA, which is deoxyribonucleic acid. It's the thing that makes us who we are, right? And chromosomes have specific sections on them that are called genes. So as we talk more about Mendel, we're going to talk a lot about different vocabulary words, because a lot of the different things that he figured out and that deal with genetics come with weird vocabulary words. So make sure you're paying attention in this section. The first vocabulary word that you're really going to need to make sure you know is the word purebred. Okay, I'm sure you've heard purebred before. Whenever you think of maybe like racehorses or dogs, some people prefer a type of dog or a type of horse straight from the same lineage. So it has to be a purebred lab or a purebred type of horse that was bred specifically for speed. Nowhere along the line did that horse ever mate with a different type of horse. Okay, purebred in the term of genetics means that you're going to have an offspring with the same exact traits. So that means a purebred short pea plant would have to have short parent plants. Okay? That's the only trait it could offer down. Now there's also another word for purebred, which is why I have it in parentheses. It's called homozygous. The prefix homo means same. So homozygous is an organism with the same traits, okay? A hybrid organism or hybrid offspring is going to have two different forms for the trait. So you know you get one from dad and one from mom. Well, if you are a hybrid organism, that means you got a different trait from mom than you got from dad, okay? And that makes you a hybrid. An example is a hybrid tall pea plant could end up having a short and a tall parent. So two different traits, right? Another word for hybrid is heterozygous, with the prefix hetero meaning different. Okay, so heterozygous is an offspring that's going to have two different forms of the trait. If the trait is for height, then that means it's going to carry a tall and a short trait. So when we look at the passing of traits, we're going to often refer to the different passings as generations. So the first generation that we're going to deal with are going to be your parent organisms or your parent plants. And this is going to be referred to as the P generation. So the first line of crossing that we're going to be doing between organisms is the P generation. When they breed and make new organisms, that is now called the F1 generation, because they are the offspring or the children of the P or parent generation. Now, when F1 gets crossed to make more organisms, that just follows down the line, and it's going to be F2, and then F3 and F4, so on and so forth, okay? So it starts at P, and then it goes F1, F2, F3, and however long the lineage may be. So when we talk about heterozygous and homozygous and purebred and hybrid, a lot of words that are going to come up are genes and alleles, okay? So genes is described as factors that control a trait. You're going to get one from each parent, okay? Alleles are different forms of that gene. So if the gene is coming through for height, then the different forms of the gene of height is going to be short or tall, right? So the alleles for the gene of height is going to be short or tall. And traits are controlled by the alleles that you get from your parents. So all these traits that you're going to be getting, the characteristics that you're going to be getting, they're all coming from the alleles that you get from mom and from dad. When we talk about alleles, they can either be dominant or recessive. A dominant allele is the one that will always show up when present. So if you have a dominant allele given to you from either mom or from dad, then no matter what, that trait is the one that's going to show up in you, okay? Because dominant is powerful, it will override all other traits. When we talk about dominant traits and we use representations, we always use letters. And a dominant trait is going to be represented by a capital letter, okay? So keep in mind you get 2 alleles, one from mom, one from dad. And if you have, let's say you get 2 capital letters, that means you got 2 dominant alleles. A dominant allele from mom, a dominant allele from dad. You could also get a dominant and a lowercase letter, which means it is recessive. If it is a recessive allele, then that means that the trait is going to be hidden if a dominant allele shows up with it. So in the situation right here, where you have a big A and a little a, that means the big A represents a dominant trait, and the little a represents the recessive one. Well, even though you have a copy of each, the one that's going to show up in you is going to be the dominant trait, because the dominant always overrides the recessive. Okay? That just now means that you're a carrier of a recessive trait that you could possibly pass on to your offspring, but inside of you, mom and dad gave you a dominant and then a recessive, so the dominant trait is going to be the trait that shows through for you. The only time a recessive trait will show up is whenever you have 2 of them. Okay? So little a is going to give you the recessive trait. If there's a capital letter there, you're not ever going to get the recessive trait because the dominant one will always shine through. So if you look at this example up here, we have in the top column, we have big G, little g as the letter combination, and that was one parent. And then the other parent's allele combination was big G, little g too. Okay, so both the parents had a dominant and a recessive trait to pass on. Okay? Dominant, recessive. So let's do a little bit of practice. I want you guys to look at the code that I'm giving you, and you tell me what trait the organism is getting. Knowing what you know about dominant traits always shining through if they're present, and a capital letter is always representing dominant, you need to figure out, in the first 3 situations, if that organism is going to have brown hair or red hair. The bottom part has big G equals short, little g is tall, so figure out if the organism is going to be short or tall. Pause the video and do the practice, and then I'll give you the answers. So for the first one, big T, little t, because there is a dominant trait there, big T, it is automatically going to get the dominant trait, brown hair. Second situation, there are two big T's, so that one is automatically going to get brown hair too. Now in the third situation, there are no dominant letters in that, right? There's no capital letters. That means it is not getting a dominant trait. Instead, it is going to get the recessive trait, which is red hair. In the bottom situation, you have two capital letters. So that means that organism is going to be short. The second organism has no capital letters, so it's automatically going to be tall. The third organism has one capital letter and one lowercase letter. Even though that lowercase letter is there, it does not matter because the capital letter overrides the lowercase letter, so that organism is going to be short. Alright, so now let's practice a little bit with the vocabulary. I want you to label each of these 6 examples as either hybrid organisms or purebred organisms. Remember that a hybrid is going to have 2 different alleles, and purebreds are going to have 2 of the same alleles, right? So, the first example, big T, little t, those are 2 different letters, 2 different alleles, they are hybrids. Big T, 2 of the same alleles, they're a purebred. Little t, 2 of the same alleles, purebred. Big G, same alleles. Little g, same alleles, so all those are purebreds. And then big G, little g makes it a hybrid because they are different. One capital letter, one lowercase letter. Now remember that there is other examples of this vocab. Remember how we talked about for a hybrid, another word for it is heterozygous. And then for the purebred, another word for that was homozygous. And the key way to remember it is by these prefixes here. Hetero meaning different, homo meaning same. So next, the vocab words we got to talk about are phenotype and genotype. Phenotype is an organism's physical appearance. So the trait that they have clearly shows up and you can actually see it with your eyes. So the phenotype of an organism could be brown hair, blue eyes, freckles, widow's peak, attached earlobe. All those are things that you can actually see about that organism. It is its phenotype. The key way I remember this is pH in phenotype and pH in physical appearance. So the phenotype is something you physically see. It is on the outside, right? The genotype is going to be on the inside, something you can't see. This is the organism's genetic makeup. So it's their allele combination. So it's that 2 little letters, 2 uppercase letters, or 2 of the same. I'm messing all up. It can be 2 of the same letters, or it can be 2 different letters. Okay? So the genetic makeup is their allele combination, 2 little letters, or 2 uppercase letters, or a big and a little letter. That is an organism's genotype, their genetic makeup. Key way to remember that, GEN in genotype, GEN in genetic makeup. Genotype you cannot see. It is coded inside of them. Phenotype is the trait you actually see on the outside. This slide wants you to practice a little bit more. It gives you the genotype, right? So it gives you the letter combination. It wants you to come up with the phenotype for the first part, okay? So for the genotype big T, little t, your phenotype would be the trait that actually shows up. So is it going to be brown hair or red hair? Well, because there is a uppercase letter in the first example, it automatically gets the dominant trait of brown hair. So for number 1, you should write brown hair. For number 2, I see 2 capital letters, which means it automatically gets that dominant trait. So its phenotype would be brown hair as well. The third example are two lowercase letters, and whenever you have two lowercase letters, the only trait it can get is the recessive one, so its phenotype would be red here. The next part describes the different phenotypes, and you have to come up with the genotype. So if it tells you that it is homozygous short, homo means two of the same, and short is represented by big G, so two of the same uppercase letters, big G, big G. Okay, that's its genotype. The next one says heterozygous short. Hetero means different. Short is represented by a capital G, so two different alleles. Now it's heterozygous short because it ended up being short because the dominant trait there is short. Even though it carries this lowercase g right here, it does not show up because it is masked by the uppercase allele, which stands for short. Okay. The next or the last example says purebred tall. Purebred meaning the same. It is pure. It has two of the same letter combinations. And tall is represented by little g. So purebred is two of the same little g's. Okay? So that is your genotype for that example. The last thing we're going to talk about is Punnett squares. And Punnett squares are defined as tables that show you the probability of getting a trait. So we use these to set up mom and dad's alleles and figure out the probability of them passing on a specific trait to their offspring. How we do a Punnett square is the first step is to put the parents' alleles on the side and the top of the table. It doesn't matter which parent you put where, okay? So you will start by having a square and putting a plus sign in it. So it makes 4 boxes. And you put the parents' alleles on the top and side. So let's say dad is big T, little t, and mom is big T, little t. That's step 1. Step 2 says you have to drop the top letters down and bring the side letters across. So if we are using big R, little r in both of these situations, whenever you fill it in, you take this big R and drop it down. See how the big R went down? Little r goes down. Okay. Big R goes across, so there's that big R, there's that big R. And then little r goes across. There's a little r, there's a little r. Okay, so then that gives us the possible genotypes or allele combinations for their children. So let's do a little bit of practice here. It gives you mom and dad's genes, and it puts them on the top and the side of the Punnett square. First step, they did for us. We got mom and dad allele combinations. Second step is we have to drop the top letters down, so that big B goes down and little b goes down. And you're typically always going to put the uppercase letter before the lowercase letter, okay? So now we have to bring these across. So little b goes across, little b goes across. And then same for this side, little b, little b. All right? Now the next one, big T, little t. Both parents have big T, little t. So they are heterozygous or hybrids, right? So let's bring the big T down. See how we brought it down? Now we're going to bring the little t down. All right. Then we're going to bring these guys across. So big T goes across. And then little t goes across. And there you have your second Punnett square. This last part asks you a little bit of questions. So it pretty much asks you to analyze your Punnett squares. The first part said, what percentage of the offspring inside of the first Punnett square will not be able to roll their tongue? So not being able to roll their tongue was represented by the recessive trait. Okay? And the only way to get that recessive trait was if you had 2 of them. Okay? Because we know if there's a dominant trait there, you're not going to get the recessive one because the dominant one powers through. So when you look at your Punnett square, when we did it, there were 2 out of 4 of the squares that had little b in it, which means 50% of their offspring will not be able to roll their tongue. The second Punnett square question says what percentage of the offspring are going to have dimples? Okay, so we represented dimples by big T. And to get dimples, anytime there's a big T there, you're going to get dimples. So that means if you had a big T, little t, you're going to get dimples. Or if you even had big T, little t there, that means you're going to get dimples too. Even though that recessive trait's there, it's hidden because a dominant one is with it as well. So in your Punnett square, there was 1 square out of 4 that had big T, and there were 2 squares in the Punnett square that had big T, little t. When you add those together and count up how many squares total had a capital letter in it, you get 3 out of 4, which means that 75% of the offspring are going to have dimples. Alright, so if you guys have any questions, please make sure you mark it and ask me when we go over this next week. Thanks.